A New Mind. Continuing the previous text by Edward Carpenter on what he names cosmic consciousness, in the book, From Adam's Peak to Elephanter. A few words remain to be added about psychological origin. Although in the birth of cosmic consciousness moral nature plays an important part, it will be better for many reasons to confine our attention at present to the evolution of intellect. In this evolution there are 4 distinct steps. The first of them was taken when upon the primary quality of excitability, sensation was established. At this point began the acquisition and more or less perfect registration of sense impressions, that is, of percepts. A percept is of course a sense impression. If we could go back far enough, we would find among our ancestors a creature whose whole intellect was made up simply of these percepts. But this creature had in it what may be called an eligibility of growth. And what happened with it was something like this. Individually and from generation to generation it accumulated these percepts, the constant repetition of which, calling for further and further registration, led in the struggle for existence and under the law of natural selection to an accumulation of cells in the central sense ganglia. At last a condition was reached in which it became possible for our ancestor to combine groups of these percepts into what we today call a recept. This process is very similar to that of composite photography. Similar percepts, as of a tree, are registered one over the other until they are generalized into the percept of a tree. The work of accumulation begins again on a higher plane, where sensory organs keep steadily at work manufacturing percepts. Receptual centers keep steadily at work manufacturing more and yet more recepts from the old and the new percepts. The capacity of central ganglia is constantly taxed to do necessary registration of percepts, the necessary elaboration of these into recepts. Then as the ganglia by use and selection are improved, they constantly manufacture from percepts and from the initial simple recepts, more and more complex, that is higher and higher recepts. At last, after many thousands of generations have lived and died, comes a time when the mind has reached the highest possible point of purely receptual intelligence. The accumulation of percepts and of recepts has gone on until no greater stores of impressions can be laid up and no further elaboration of these can be accomplished on the plane of receptual intelligence. Then another break is made and the higher recepts are replaced by concepts. The relation of a concept to a recept is somewhat similar to the relation of algebra to arithmetic. A recept is a composite image of hundreds, perhaps thousands of percepts. It is itself an image abstracted from many images, but a concept is that same composite image, that same recept named, ticketed, and as it were dismissed. A concept is in fact neither more nor less than a named recept, the name that is the sign, as in algebra standing henceforth for the thing itself, that is for the recept. It is clear to anyone who will give the least thought to the subject, that the revolution by which concepts are substituted for recepts increases the efficiency of the brain for thought as much as the introduction of machinery increases the capacity of the race for output, as much as the use of algebra increases the power of the mind in mathematical calculation. To replace a great cumbersome recept by a simple sign was almost like replacing actual goods, such as wheat, fabrics and hardware, by entries in a ledger. However, as hinted previously, in order that a recept may be replaced by a concept it must be named, or in other words marked with a sign which stands for it, just as a check stands for a listed piece of goods. In other words, the race that is in possession of concepts is also, and necessarily, in possession of language. Furthermore, it should be noted as the possession of concepts implies the possession of language, so the possession of concepts and language, which are in reality 2 aspects of the same thing, implies the possession of self-consciousness. All this means that there is a moment in the evolution of mind when the receptual intellect, capable of simple consciousness only, becomes almost or quite instantaneously a conceptual intellect in possession of language and self-consciousness. Our intellect then today is made up of a very complex mixture of percepts, recepts and concepts. The next chapter in the story is the accumulation of concepts, which is a double process, where each individual accumulates a larger and larger number, while individual concepts are becoming constantly more and more complex. Is there to be any limit to this growth of concepts in number and complexity? Whoever will seriously consider that question will see that there must be a limit. No such process could go on to infinity. We have seen that the expansion of the perceptual mind had a necessary limit, that its continued life led inevitably up to and into the receptual mind, that the receptual mind by its own growth was inevitably led up to and into the conceptual mind. A priori considerations make it certain that a corresponding outlet will be found for the conceptual mind. But we do not need to depend upon abstract reasoning to demonstrate the necessary existence of the supraconceptual mind, since it exists and can be studied with no more difficulty than other natural phenomena. The supraconceptual intellect, the elements of which instead of being concepts are intuitions, is already, in small numbers it is true, an established fact, and the form of consciousness that belongs to that intellect may be called and has been called cosmic consciousness. The basic fact in cosmic consciousness is implied in its name. That fact is consciousness of the cosmos. This is what is called in the East, Brahmic splendor, which is in Dante's phrase capable of transhumanizing a man into a god. Walt Whitman has a great deal to say about it and speaks of it in one place as ineffable light, light rare, untellable, lighting the very light beyond all signs, description and languages. This consciousness shows the cosmos to consist not of dead matter governed by unconscious, rigid and unintending law. It shows it on the contrary as entirely immaterial, entirely spiritual and entirely alive. It shows that death is an absurdity, that everyone and everything has eternal life. It shows that the universe is God and that God is the universe. A great deal of this is of course from the point of view of self-consciousness absurd. It is nevertheless undoubtedly true. Now all this does not mean that when a person has cosmic consciousness they know everything about the universe. We all know that when at 3 years of age we acquired self-consciousness, we did not at once know all about ourselves. So neither does one know all about the cosmos merely because we become conscious of it. If it has taken the race several thousand years to learn a smattering of the science of humanity since its acquisition of self-consciousness, so it may take it millions of years to acquire cosmic consciousness. As on self-consciousness is based the human world as we see it with all its works and ways, so on cosmic consciousness is based higher religions and higher philosophies, then what comes from them, and on it will be based when it becomes more general, a new world of which it would be idle to try to speak today. The philosophy of the birth of cosmic consciousness in an individual is similar to that of the birth of self-consciousness. The mind becomes overcrowded as it were, with concepts, and these are constantly becoming larger, more numerous and more complex. Some day, conditions being all favorable, the fusion, or what might be called the chemical union, of several of them and of certain moral elements takes place. The result is an intuition and the establishment of intuitive mind, or in other words cosmic consciousness. A scheme by which the mind is built up is uniform from beginning to end. A recept is made of many percepts, a concept of many or several recepts and percepts, and an intuition is made of many concepts, recepts and percepts together with other elements belonging to and drawn from moral nature. Cosmic vision or cosmic intuition, from which what may be called the new mind takes its name, is thus seen to be simply the complex union of all prior thought and experience, just as self-consciousness is the complex union of all thought and experience prior to it. Cosmic consciousness, like other forms of consciousness, is capable of growth. It may have different forms and different degrees. It must not be supposed that because one has cosmic consciousness that we are therefore omniscient, or infallible. Beings of cosmic consciousness have reached a higher level, but on that level there can be different degrees of consciousness. And it must be still more evident that however godlike the faculty may be, those who first acquire it, living in diverse ages and countries, passing their life in different surroundings, brought up to view life from totally different points of view, must necessarily interpret somewhat differently those things which they see in the new world into which they enter. Language corresponds to the intellect and is therefore capable of expressing it perfectly and directly. On the other hand, the functions of moral nature are not connected with language and are only capable of indirect and imperfect expression by its agency. Perhaps music, which certainly has its roots in moral nature, is as at present existent the beginning of a language that will tally and express emotions as words tally and express ideas. Language is the exact tally of the intellect. For every concept there is a word or words, and for every word there is a concept. No word can come into being except as the expression of a concept. Neither can a new concept be formed without the formation of at the same time the new word which is its expression. But as a matter of fact, 99% of our sense impressions and emotions have never been represented in the intellect by concepts, and therefore remain unexpressed and inexpressible, except by roundabout description and suggestion. As the correspondence of words and concepts is not casual or temporary, but resides in the nature of these and continues during all time and under all circumstances absolutely constant, so changes in one of the factors must correspond with changes in the other. So evolution of intellect must be accompanied by evolution of language. An evolution of language will be evidence of evolution of intellect. It seems that in every, or nearly every individual who enters into cosmic consciousness, apprehension is at first more or less excited, the person doubting whether the new sense may not be a symptom or form of insanity. The Holy Prophet Muhammad was greatly alarmed. The Apostle Paul was also alarmed in like manner. There is much therefore in asylums offering glimpses of other dimension. The first thing each person asks themselves upon experiencing the new sense is, does what I see and feel represent reality, or am I suffering from delusion? The fact that new experience seems even more real than old teachings of consciousness does not at first fully reassure us, because we know the force of delusion. Simultaneously or instantly following the aforementioned sense and emotional experience, there comes to the individual an intellectual illumination quite impossible to describe. Like a flash of intuition, there is presented to our consciousness a clear conception, a vision or epiphany in outline of the meaning and drift of the universe. We do not come to believe merely, but see and know that the cosmos, which to the self-conscious mind seems made up of dead matter, is in fact far otherwise. It is in truth a living presence. We see that instead of mankind being as it were patches of life scattered throughout an infinite sea of non-living substance, we are in reality specks of relative death in an infinite ocean of life. We see that the life in man is eternal, as all life is eternal, that the soul of man is as immortal as God is. One learns infinitely much of the new, especially such a conception of the whole, or at least of an immense whole as dwarfs all conception, imagination or speculation, such a conception as makes the old attempts to mentally grasp the universe and its meaning petty and even ridiculous. This expansion of the intellect enormously increases the capacity both for learning and for initiating. The history of the development and appearance of cosmic consciousness in humanity is the same as that of the development of all the various psychic faculties. These faculties appear first in certain exceptional individuals, then become more frequent, thereafter become susceptible to development in all, and at last begin to belong to everyone from their birth. Rare, exceptional, unique abilities appear in humanity during maturity, sometimes even in senility. Becoming more common, they manifest as talents in younger men, and then appear as abilities even in children, at last becoming the common property of all from their birth. Thereafter absence is regarded as a monstrosity. Such is the faculty of speech, i.e. the faculty of making concepts. Probably in a distant past, at the beginning of the appearance of self-consciousness, this faculty was the gift of a few exceptional individuals, and began then to appear perhaps in senility. After that it began to appear more frequently and to manifest itself earlier. Probably there was a period when speech was not a gift of all peoples, just as are not at present artistic talents, a musical sense, the sense of color, perspective and form. Gradually it became possible for all and then inevitable and necessary, if some physical defect did not prevent its manifestation. Comments now follow on quotations made from Dr. Buck's book. 1. Though Dr. Buck's opinion is quoted here regarding 3 anticipated revolutions, it must be noted that his optimism regarding social life is not shared, where he assumes that change will come about due to material causes, the communications and social revolution enabling a utopian global village. the ground for favorable changes in our outer life, provided such changes are generally possible, come about only through changes in our inner lives, i.e., those changes which Dr. Bucky calls psychical revolution. This is the only thing that can create a better future for humanity. Cultural conquests in the realm of the material are double-edged, may equally serve for good or for evil. A change of consciousness can alone be a guarantee of the surcease of willful misuses of powers given by culture, and only thus will culture cease to become a growth of barbarity. Democratic organization and the nominal rule of the majority guarantee nothing. On the contrary, even now where they're realized, though only in name, they create without delay, and promise in future to create on a larger scale violence toward the minority, the limitation of the individual and the curtailment of freedom. 2. Dr. Bucky says that once human consciousness is attained, then further evolution is inevitable. In this affirmation, Dr. Bucky makes a mistake common to all those who dogmatize evolution. Having painted a true picture of consecutive gradations of the forms of consciousness observed by us, of mineral, vegetable, of animal and of man, Dr. Bucky considers this gradation exclusively in the light of the evolution of one form from another, not admitting the possibility of other points of view. For example, the fact that each of the existing forms is a link of separate evolutionary chains, i.e. that the evolutions of minerals, vegetables, of animals and of men are different, go by different routes and do not impinge upon one another. This standpoint is justifiable when we take into consideration the fact that we never know transitional forms. Furthermore, Dr. Bucky makes an arbitrary conclusion concerning the inevitability of the further evolution of man, because unconscious evolution, i.e. unconscious for the individual directed by the consciousness of the species in the vegetable and animal kingdoms, is impossible with the appearance of reasoning in man. It is necessary to recognize that the mind of a man depends upon itself to a considerably greater degree than the mind of an animal. The mind of a man has far more power over itself. It can assist in its own evolution, but it can also impede it. We are confronted with the general question, can unconscious evolution proceed with the appearance of reasoning? It is more correct to suppose that the appearance of reasoning annihilates the possibility of unconscious evolution. Power over evolution passes from the group soul, or from nature, to the individual itself. Further evolution, if it takes place at all, cannot be an elemental and unconscious affair, but will result solely from conscious effort toward growth. This is the most interesting point in the whole process, but Dr. Bucky fails to develop it. Man, not striving toward evolution, not conscious of its possibility and not helping it, will not evolve, and most importantly of all, the individual who is not evolving does not remain in a static condition either, but backslides, goes down and degenerates, i.e. some elements begin their own evolution, inimical to the whole. This is general law, and if we take into consideration what an infinitesimal percentage of men think and are capable of thinking of their evolution or their striving toward higher things, then we shall see that to talk about the inevitability of this evolution is at the very least naive. 3. Speaking of the formation of a higher faculty of knowledge and reason, Dr. Bucky fails to take into consideration one very important circumstance. He himself previously remarks that the blending of concepts with emotional elements proceeds in the mind, and as a result of this a new understanding appears, and then cosmic consciousness. Thus it follows from his own words that cosmic consciousness is not simply a blending of concepts with emotional elements, or ideas with feelings, but is the result of this blending. Dr. Bucky, however, does not dwell on this with sufficient attention. Furthermore, he regards the fundamental element of cosmic consciousness as the blending of sensations, perceptions and concepts with elements properly belonging to emotional nature. This is a mistake, because one element of cosmic consciousness is not simply the blending of thought and feeling, but the result of this blending, or in other words, thought and feeling plus something else, that is absent either in the intellect or in emotional nature. Dr. Bucky regards this new faculty of understanding and reasoning as a product of the evolution of existing faculties, and this vitiates all his deductions. Let us imagine then that some scientist from another planet, not suspecting the existence of man, studies a horse and its evolution from colt through to saddle horse, then regards as its highest evolution the horse with the horseman in the saddle. From our standpoint, it is clearly impossible to regard a man sitting in the horse's saddle as a fact of horse evolution, but from the point of view of the scientist who knows nothing about man, this will be quite logical. Dr. Bucky finds himself in this same position when regarding that which transcends the region of humanity altogether as a fact of human evolution. Man possessing cosmic consciousness, or approaching cosmic consciousness, is not merely man, but man with something higher added. Dr. Bucky, like Edward Carpenter in many cases also, is handicapped by the desire not to strongly counter accepted views, although that is inevitable, by the desire to reconcile those views with new thought, to flatten out contradictions, to reduce everything to one thing, which is of course impossible, as is the reconciliation of correct and incorrect, true and false views upon one and the same thing. The greater part of Dr. Bucky's book consists of examples and quotations from the teachings and writings of men of cosmic consciousness in the history of the world. He draws parallels between these teachings, and establishes the unity of the forms of transition into the new state of consciousness in men of different centuries and of different peoples, and the unity of their sensations of the world and of the self, testifying more than anything else to the genuineness and reality of their experiences. The founders of world religions, prophets, philosophers, poets, these are men of cosmic consciousness according to Dr. Bucky's book. He does not pretend to present a full list of them, and it is of course possible to add many names to that roster. Dr. Bucky, however, makes an important error concerning self-consciousness. In his opinion, simple consciousness characterizes an animal and self-consciousness characterizes a man. As a matter of fact, however, a prolonged period of self-consciousness during sensation, feeling or thinking, is a very rare phenomenon in man. Usually that which is called self-consciousness is simply thought and it goes post factum. True self-consciousness exists in man only potentially, and if it manifests itself at all, then it does so only by moments. These moments of self-consciousness should not, however, be identified with prolonged self-consciousness. Prolonged self-consciousness is already a new consciousness, and there is the possibility of moments of cosmic consciousness, which in the course of further development may in turn become prolonged. Various little imperfections of Dr. Bucky's book are nonetheless not important, nor additions which might possibly be made. What is important is the general conclusion to which Dr. Bucky comes, the possibility and the imminence of new consciousness. All this announces to us the proximity of a new humanity. However, we are building without taking into consideration the fact that a new master must come into our lives who may not like everything that we have built. Our social sciences, sociology and so forth have in view only man, while, as has been shown several times before, the concept man is complex and includes within itself different categories of men going along different paths. The future belongs not to man, but to Superman, who is already born and lives among us. A higher race is emerging among humanity, and it is emerging by reason of its quite remarkable understanding of the world and of life. It will be truly a higher race, and there will be no possibility of any falsification, any substitution or any usurpation at all. It will not be possible for anything to be bought, or appropriated to oneself by deceit or through might. Not only will this race be, but it already is. Those approaching the transition into a new race begin already to know one another. Already are established passwords and countersigns. Perhaps those social and political questions so sharply put forward in our time will be solved on quite another plane and by quite different methods than we presume. Perhaps by the entrance into the arena of a new race conscious of itself that will judge the old. Attention was called to certain imperfections in Dr. Bucky's book arising chiefly from a strange indecisiveness of his, from his timidity in asserting the dominant significance of the new consciousness. This arises from the desire of Dr. Bucky to establish the future of humanity from a positivistic standpoint, founded upon social and political revolution. We may regard this view as having lost all validity. The bankruptcy of materialism, i.e. of logical systems, when it comes to organizing life on Earth is now evident in the bloody epoch which has been endured, even to those who but yesterday were prattling of culture and civilization. It becomes clearer and clearer that the changes in the outer life of the majority, when these changes come, will come about as a result of inner changes in a few. We may say further with regard to Dr. Bucky's book, that touching the idea of the natural growth of consciousness, he fails to notice that these faculties do not unfold themselves perforce, conscious work on them is necessary. And he does not dwell upon conscious efforts in this direction, on the idea of the culture of cosmic consciousness. Meanwhile, there exists a whole series of psychological teachings, occultism, yoga, shamanism, etc., and a large literature having in view a systematic culture of higher consciousness. Dr. Bucky does not remark this and insists upon the idea of natural growth, although he himself several times touches on the culture of consciousness. In one portion of his book he speaks contemptuously regarding the use of narcotics for the creation of ecstatic states or revelation, not taking into consideration the fact that narcotics cannot give anything that humankind does not already possess. This is the explanation of the different action of narcotics on different people, but can only in certain cases unfold that which is already in the soul. This entirely alters the point of view on narcotics, as Professor William James has shown in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. In general, allured by the evolutionary point of view and looking at the future, Dr. Bucky, like many others, does not pay sufficient attention to the present. That new consciousness which may be discovered or unfold in the here and now is indeed far more important than that which may or may not appear in other millennia.